I give you a few. Right. By the way, the meeting is recorded, as you might have seen. So if you don't want to be recorded, if you don't want your face to be recorded, just turn off your video. We do suggest the video to stay off for the time of the presentation, and unless you need it, to share your question, you can just switch off your video so that this will ease the connection for those who have less data available. Okay. So I hope everyone is familiar with the reaction button. I'm leaving you a few minutes to check that out. Thank you, Elsa, for making that clearer than how I pronounce than the way I explained it. Okay, so returning to the program, after Ute, we will have the second presentation from Christer Schönström, Stockholm University, and with his presentation on development of rating scales for a sentence repetition test for Swedish Sign Language. Again, we will have a 20-minute speech and 10 minutes for Q&A. Then we will give ourselves and the interpreters a 10 minutes break, after which we will come back at 10:20-ish with the third presentation on the development of a fluency rating scale for Swiss German Sign Language by Katja Tissi, Franz Holzneck, and Tobias Haag of the University of Teacher Education and Special Needs in Zurich, Alessia Battisti from the University of Zurich, and Nivia De Jong from Leiden University. Again, I apologize for the bad pronunciation. And after the last speech, we will have a little more time for questions, either to the authors themselves or to the previous authors. Is our discussion phase. Please remember that at the end of each workshop, we share a survey in which we normally ask you if you were interested in the topic, if you like the way we worked today, and if you have suggestions for future webinars. This survey is important for us because we base our our webinars on this. So if you can just stay a few extra minutes after the end of the workshop, that would be ideal for us to pick up your feedback. Again, we're very happy today for having this opportunity to host international guests. And most of all, we're very thankful to IALTA for funding the interpreting costs, as well as the, I'm looking for the name, the University of Teacher Education and Special Needs, Institute for Language and Communication, who has also contributed this time, which allows us to host a 2.5 hours webinar. So we're very thankful for that. Oh, Tobias, thank you for the link to the survey. We'll share it later. Okay. So I guess I have said most of it. So I will leave the table to Ute Knosch for her speech on, let me find the title again.
Considerations in rating scale development and validation.
There you go. Thank you very much, Ute. Thank you. And okay, I'll take myself out of the pin. Please.
Thank you, Maria. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, you can only see my screen now, not the note pages.
Yes, we do it. Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation and also for being so nice in scheduling for a different time so that I don't have to get up in the middle of the night. I really appreciate it. I think my role today is to set the scene a little bit for the talks afterwards, sort of a little bit theoretically. So I'll do my best with that. So my paper, as I already said, is entitled Considerations in Rating Scale Development and Validation. And a good chunk of what I'm talking about today is actually already published in the journal Language Testing. And I just want to acknowledge my co-authors, Bart Degers and Apishat Kambunrang, who've contributed to that paper. So as you can see in the images here, rating scales used in language assessment can take a variety of forms. But whatever format they take, they're seen as a really important ingredient in the scoring of productive performances because they represent the test construct to raters. Now, McQueen really helpfully differentiates between two types of test constructs. Those stated in public materials of the test, which she called the stated test construct. And this is usually what you find on test developer websites or in their official documentation about their tests. And on the other hand, those constructs that are actually operationalized. And rating scales fall under the operationalized test construct because they represent to raters what they actually should be looking for. However, in my presentation today, I will argue that rating scales are often at odds with the stated test construct. And I think the reason for this is because we just don't give enough consideration when we're developing that. So it's not on purpose, but it's just because they're not developed particularly thoughtfully. So in my talk today, I will briefly comment on how rating scale development has been described in the literature many years before the publication of this paper that I'm talking about today. And I will then go on to describe a corpus of studies that we collected and coded to explore how rating scales are actually developed in our field. And based on that study, we developed a model of various sources of scale construct. And then later on in the talk at the end, I will show how this model can be used for both rating scale development and validation. So test development is described in many details in our professional standards documents and in all sorts of other publications. But scale development, on the other hand, and how this relates to the larger stated and operationalized test construct is often surprisingly absent from these documents. And also, there's often no information provided about the possible sources that may influence constructs and rating scales. Looking at the literature, Fulcher has been very active in writing about this, or was very active in writing about this in the early 2000s. And he distinguished between two major approaches to scale development. First of all, there were the intuitive methods, where rating scales are designed either drawing on other existing rating scales or on scale developers' own intuitions. On the other hand, he described empirical methods, which involve scale developers carefully examining features of performances collected from test takers to develop the rating scale descriptors. This dichotomous description of scale design was further held up by a 2011 publication that he was also involved in, but unfortunately, it was a little bit different, that description, and it confused quite a lot of people. I know quite a few of my PhD students always struggled with this. The second bullet point here, performance data driven, is pretty much exactly what he had in the earlier publication, what was called empirical methods. So where performances from test takers are used to create the rating scale, but measurement driven was different to the intuitive methods, which he described earlier. And this was, he described this as prioritizing the ordering of descriptors on a single scale, that meaning is derived from a scaling methodology, and the agreement of judgment as to the place of the descriptors on the scale. So Fulcher's conceptualizations of rating scale development has profoundly influenced research in language testing. However, others have noted that this dichotomous conceptualization does not always reflect reality, and that test developers draw on a range of sources when developing scales. And certainly in my own work, when I was a PhD student, for example, I found this dichotomy really confusing and not very helpful, actually, and not representative of practice. So that was the impetus. Oh, I'm sorry.
Ute,
Yes.
to interrupt. There were some feedback from deaf participants that when you change a new slide, if you can leave, people quickly scan, read the text before you start.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks a lot.
So this issue of this dichotomous conceptualization being problematic was kind of what was the impetus for this study. So the aims of the study was to gain a clearer understanding of what actually happens in real-world rating scale development. And the research questions we posed was, which sources typically impact rating scale design in public research? So we conducted a systematic review of empirical peer-reviewed publications, and we've only focused on those that looked at scale development or scale revisions in language assessment and testing. We did a principled search through various databases and also key language testing journals. And we ended up with 36 peer-reviewed journal articles. Now, we actually had a larger corpus of about 50 studies, because we also initially had studies that we had just collected, PhD theses, research reports from language testing agencies, or any other kind of scale development studies that we could put our hands on. But when we submitted this for publication with the journal, we were told that we had to exclude all those because they were not peer-reviewed. So we excluded quite a lot of studies, and I'm happy to talk about that in question time. Anyway, we had this corpus of 36 peer-reviewed studies, and then we developed a coding scheme to kind of extract all the sources of scale construct that were mentioned in these papers. So as a result, we identified 10 different sources of scale construct in the studies, and I'll just go through them. So first of all, there was theory or literature review, where the scale developers drew on a review of the literature or a theory of language proficiency development to inform the scale construct. Examples include models of language development, models of communicative competence, functional adequacy, comprehensibility, and so on. The second one was the target language use domain, where the scale developers drew on information about the target language use domain by involving either domain experts, analyzing target language use discourse, reviewing the literature about the target language use domain, and so on. The third source of scale construct was standards framework, for example, such as the Common European Framework of Reference that we're also familiar with. Another source of scale construct were curriculum documents or syllabi. Another one was expert intuition, existing rating scales, performance samples from test takers. Another group that we grouped together was all related to raters. So this category grouped together influence on the scale based on either rater feedback, rater think aloud data, statistical rater performance data, rater background, for example. Another source of scale construct were tasks. And finally, the score reporting and score use context influenced scales as well. So coder agreement was very high, 95.4%. But I do need to mention that we initially also had an 11th source of construct, which we called scale developer intuition. But this resulted in some coding inconsistencies. And we therefore decided to get rid of it because we actually thought every scale has some sort of scale developer intuition in it, and it was difficult to code. We then grouped these sources of scale construct into test external, those that are not related directly to the test in question. Those were test internal, and then a group of others. So let me get onto the results. So this table shows how many, which sources of scale construct could be found in how many different studies. So you can see, just a reminder, there were 35 studies in total, and performance samples were a source of scale construct in all of them. Rater feedback or something with the raters was also part of pretty much every study except one. When we go to the test external sources, the most common were theory or literature review, existing rating scales, sorry, there's a typo, expert intuition, and so on. We also looked at how many different sources of scale construct were used in the different studies. And you can see here that 4 studies drew on 2 different sources, 12 studies drew on 3 different sources. And you can see there were some studies that had as many as 6 or 7 different sources of scale construct. So does the dichotomous categorization hold? Well, purely performance-based was not found at all in our corpus of studies. It was always paired with other sources. And the purely intuitive approach was also not identified at all. And there were also no clear trends in what sources typically appear together. So based on this coding of the data and the different sources that we identified, we created this model of different sources of scale construct. So you can see the test external on the left, the test internal, and then the score reporting and score use context, which we called other. And because all testing occurs in a policy space that shapes all sorts of things to do with the assessment, we also put the policy context around this model. So the model may not be complete. There may be other design choices that may exist that were not represented in our corpus of studies. And it's also possible that our data was skewed by publication bias. But despite this, we feel that this model is actually quite helpful for rating scale developers and testing specialists. Now, in the rest of the paper, I now want to show you how this model can be used. And I want to particularly talk about how it can be used for scale development and also for rating scale validation. So starting with scale development, as I already mentioned earlier, the guidelines for best practice in testing, such as the standards or the ILTA guidelines for practice, state that test development needs to start by determining the test purpose and the score use. But as I mentioned earlier in my talk, it seems that this test development thinking and the scale development sometimes seem to be at odds with each other. And I will give an example of that a little bit later in my talk. And therefore, I recommend that the model of the sources of scale construct should be integrated into the larger test development process. So this is what I think it could look like. So we should, when developing a rating scale, also start by thinking about the test purpose and the score use context. And then we should also think about 3 other aspects, which are at the bottom here in the 3 black boxes. And this is generalizability or score generalizability, the precision of post-test predictions, and score reliability. And only once all these aspects and the 5 black boxes are considered should scale development proceed. The light gray box here represents the model of scale constructs that I showed on earlier on based on our review. So how do these three considerations relate to the sources of scale construct? Sorry, let me start first by going through these three considerations. So score generalizability relates to the degree to which a score can be generalized to a new situation not expressly covered by the test construct. The precision of post-test predictions is how precisely the test can predict how well a test taker can cope in the post-test communicative situations for which the test scores are being used as predictors. And we all know what scoring reliability relates to. So how do these three considerations relate to the sources of scale construct I discussed in the paper? The table here shows, for example, if the scale construct is focused on the target language use domain, then the score generalizability is likely to be reduced to that domain, but the predictions that can be made about test takers are likely to be more precise because they're focused on a specific target language use context. On the other hand, if the scale developer draws on a model or theory from the literature review or a standards framework, then score generalizability is likely to increase as these sources of construct are generally designed to be broadly applicable. At the same time, the precision of the post-test predictions is likely to be reduced, and it's difficult to make precise predictions to a very broad score use context. And finally, I also want to briefly comment on the use of other scales. Unless you know exactly what the sources of construct were that went into the other scale and how it was developed, the effect of using other scales as your source of test construct is probably unclear, and therefore I caution against that unless there's a really good argument for doing it. So this is how the model can be used for test development. Now let's look at test validation. When we're doing rating scale validation activities, we need to start by examining the status test construct and examine how well the scale aligns with this. So if the test developer, for example, develops a test that's designed to assess academic writing, then we need to ensure that the rating scale, which is the operationalized test construct, also is appropriate for this context. Let me now take you to an example where I think the two are clearly at odds. And I actually could have pulled out quite a lot of examples from our corpus of studies, but because I didn't want to pick on any particular authors, I decided to use one that's a little bit more neutral. Now, some of you may be familiar with the ICAO rating scale, which was introduced by the International Civil Aviation Authority as a set of guidelines that guides the assessment of pilots and air traffic controllers working in the international airspace. The ICAO language proficiency requirements, or LPRs, include a rating scale comprising 6 criteria and each with 6 levels. There's no information available how the scale was created, but it's problematic as it's not reflective of the discourse in the target use domain. Let me give you 2 quick examples. So first of all, in the criterion of interaction at level 6, the highest level, the descriptors read, interacts with ease in nearly all situations, is sensible to verbal and non-verbal cues, and responds to them appropriately. And you can see here that this is inappropriate because pilots and air traffic controllers, when they're communicating, there are no non-verbal cues available to them. So this descriptor is nonsensical. Similarly, when we look at vocabulary at level 6, the descriptor reads, vocabulary range and accuracy are sufficient to communicate effectively on a wide variety of familiar and unfamiliar topics, blah, blah, blah. And then vocabulary is idiomatic. Now, this is another real problem because when pilots and air traffic controllers are communicating, they certainly should not be using idiomatic expressions. This is a big no-no in international airspace. So there is no information available about how the scale was developed, but I've made some inquiries, and I'm pretty sure what happened was that there were a group of English language teachers and linguistic experts who were involved in this, who had no understanding of the target language use domain, and they superimposed some existing rating scales that they were using in their teaching that wasn't the appropriate kind of scale to use. So as a result, the test purpose and the score use was not considered when the scale was developed, which meant that the generalizability and precisions of post-test predictions are at odds with what the actual testing context requires. And the stated test construct and the operational test construct, which is the rating scales, were at odds with each other. So it's really problematic. So let me wrap up. Every construct choice scale developers make has different implications for score generalizability and the precisions of post-test predictions, as well as score reliability. And the developers should think really carefully about the construct choices that influence the scale. Going back to this figure here, I've provided an example where the test purpose score use is at odds with the sources of scale construct, and I've talked about considering the impact of scale construct choices on the 3 boxes at the bottom. I've also mentioned that some choices of scale construct might cancel each other out in terms of its effect on generalizability and precision of post-test predictions. So the question then is, does it make sense to use many, many different sources of scale construct that may be at odds with each other? Because you remember in our corpus of studies that were some that use 6 or 7 different sources of scale construct. And I would like to argue that in many cases, this really just causes validity chaos, and I want to caution against it. And that's where I will leave you today. I hope I haven't gone over time. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. You haven't gone out of time at all. I would say you're exactly on the minute. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. A comment from Jackie Robbins in the chat. So this is your moment. You also have hand claps from the chat. So this is your moment. If you have questions for Ute, we have 10 minutes for specific questions just for Ute's speech. So if you wish, you can either write your question in the chat area, or as I was saying before, you can go to the reaction page, reaction section, and lift your hand. So this way I will see your hand, and I can add you to the pin video. Anyone? Nivia has a question. Okay. Just a second, Nivia. I will pin your video. Do you want to sign your question or speak? Oh,
Hi,
there you
Nivia.
Hi, Ute. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I was just curious about your last conclusion. I'm not sure whether I agree, and that always makes it more fun. So could you explain a bit more what you mean with validity chaos? And how come more information could not lead to a better scale?
Yeah, look, Nivia, I think that's the issue that I see in many studies. Actually, some of the larger testing agencies are kind of, I think, doing this quite a lot. So I think more information is not the way I see it, because I think some of this information is at odds with each other. So if you're developing a scale for, let's say, for a particular context, not one that's sort of just generally broadly available, then you should focus on the context and not just grab stuff from everywhere and anywhere. And when you read some of these reports, you know, they get experts in, and you've got no idea what these experts are actually doing. And then they're grabbing descriptors from the Common European Framework of Reference, and then they get domain experts in, and then they do this and that and the other, and they throw it all together. And you might say that's extra information, but to me, that's all just kind of noise rather than focusing on what you actually meant to do, which is, let's say, if there is a specific domain, focus on the domain. You know, they might have someone reviewing the literature and getting a theory from here and descriptors from there and other scales from there. And it's just, to me, it's just validity chaos. Like, we should focus on what we're actually trying to do and where we want to generalize, you know, and just focus on that. And you'd be surprised when I don't know if you've ever purposefully looked through these studies. It's actually quite surprising. I've also done this earlier on in my career. Like, I could have described some of my studies and go, there, this is rubbish and doesn't make sense. So it's not like that I want to attack anyone, but I think it is validity chaos. It really is, you know, just do a bit of this and a bit of that and throw it all together. And yeah, we've made a new scale and here we are.
Okay. Always keep thinking for yourself. That's what I remember. Make sure that you have to focus on what you want with the skill.
Right, and that it matches your actual test, like the wider test, because often it really doesn't. I mean, there's so many examples out there. Once you look, you know, it's a test for X, Y, Z, and then the scale is just grabbed from somewhere. It doesn't match.
We also have another question from the audience, from Joaquin. Nivia, if you want to continue the discussion, you're welcome to do that later in the webinar. We just want to give enough space to all. Joaquin, this is your moment. Go ahead with your question. Joaquin?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first off, thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Naug. Actually, your work is an inspiration. As you know, we've been following you from Spain quite closely. I have a question related to consensus, right? Because after working with at several projects related to scale development, I have noticed that at early stages, it is much faster to work with small groups, and then to make the final product available to the whole community. However, I also get the feeling that the more people you get involved in the project, the more likely they are to be receptive to the final product. And I have had some trouble when trying to present the final product to big groups who tend normally to dislike the scales because they didn't make the scales themselves. So this is something new. I don't want to work with this. So my question is basically whether you have had any such experience in which you had any trouble sharing the final product with the community, with the raters that were actually going to use them, and how did you manage that in case you have had such an experience? Thank you very much.
I don't have really anything great to suggest, but maybe have several phases of dissemination, you know, work with a smaller group and then have a kind of dissemination meeting where people can give input, then take it to the smaller group again. I think this issue of buy-in depends on the context, obviously. I mean, if you're like a large testing agency and people just come for payment, that's different. But if it's in a kind of smaller context where the raters actually want to have some, you know, say and buy-in is important, I guess it's important to have a process where people at least feel they have the chance to contribute. Yeah, because I think raters often really want to do that, right? And yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joaquin, for your question. We have an extra minute for a very fast question. If there are none, I would go ahead with the next. Yes, Norman.
Yeah, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was a little bit worried about your description of what you mean by reliability, because the sources of variation in the scores is a bit complicated if you use rating scales, because you have the people who are being rated, the test takers, you have the raters, and you have other sources of reliability, which are usually summarized as error or residual. And in your description, I saw that your reliability was exclusively determined by the, say, correspondence between the judgments of the raters, while the important source of difference between the test takers is neglected. And I think this is a shortcoming in many of the language testing publications, and I think we should pay attention to that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I think I'm not thinking about in my talk about it in this statistical way. It was more about rater agreements, and that I didn't really talk about that part actually much at all. I just had it on the
but
slide there
I
because
saw it in your description.
yeah, it's kind of beyond the scope of the study, but there are issues around scale construct and what the impact is on rater agreement or rater reliability. So it's, yeah, sorry if that's confusing.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Norman, for your question, and also to the other people who asked questions. Ute, thank you very much for your presentation. It's time now to move on to the next one. So I will call Christer Schönstrom to turn on his video. Yes, again, we have clapping hands for Ute. Christer, please switch on your video. There you are. So Christer will be introducing his presentation on development of rating scales for a sentence repetition test for Swedish Sign Language. Again, Christer, you have 20 minutes. I hope the video issue has been solved from those of you who reported some problems. So I will just switch off my video and leave the table to Christer, please. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Hopefully everybody can see that. Great. Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to present this morning. My name is Christer Schönstrom. This is my sign name. Today, I'm going to be talking about the development of the Swedish Sign Language test, of which we have done the CRT for, and we'll be talking about the scale. So today I'm going to talk about these three items in my talk. I'll be giving you a bit of a background of what we've done so far in terms of our testing development. Then I will present to you the rating scales, well, two of them that we have developed. They are both SRT tests. The sentence repetition test. So yeah, I'll talk about that. And then finally, I'll do a comparison of those two that we have developed in terms of the scales and the scoring that we utilize. So my presentation will be really about what our process has been, how we do our measurements, how we figure out what our scores are. So I don't have time today to go into a real in-depth as to what our results have been. So my presentation will be limited to that specific scope. So until now, I've been involved with several sign language testing related projects. The first one that I got involved with, I mean, I was quite young at the time, just working as a research assistant. And I was involved in a particular project based on the sign language, American Sign Language test, which we then took and modified for the Swedish context. So this was in the very early 2000s that we were doing this. So that was my first experience, and it was a part of my PhD project, actually. So I was focused on bilingual education for deaf children, not specifically testing, but I did need to do some work on assessments, on written Swedish, and those kinds of things. So my whole project wasn't based on assessments and testing, but there was some of it involved in what I had to do. So I eventually we developed the Swedish Sign Language SRT test, and we did that in collaboration with Peter Hauser, who developed the ASL SRT test, and we adapted that for the Swedish Sign Language context. And then I did another project here at Stockholm University with Ingela Holstrom, and we developed another test which focused more on L2 learners of Swedish Sign Language. So these two assessments that we have, that we've done research on, we do have them published already. And if you'd like to know more about them in detail, you're free to take a look at those studies that we have published. We also developed the STS communication assessment for staff that were working at deaf schools. So these are really focused on hearing people coming in to teach deaf children and looking at their communication skills and needing to have an assessment to make sure that they identify where they were and aligned with on the SEFR. But I'm not going to be talking about that today. So what we know about the SRT so far is that there are many sign languages who have now adapted it from the ASL version. There's also a Swiss German SRT test. I mean, there's several of them out and about now. And we have ours here based on Swedish Sign Language. I believe Finland is on their way to developing it. And we're looking at doing it in both directions, productive as well as receptive, and just being able to assess somebody's language skills. So we're looking at L1 users, and we can also use it to test L2 users of these languages. So in terms of their ability to comprehend, and then reproduce what they are seeing, is actually we're looking at whether or not that requires just language skills or if it relies on other things as well. And there's studies which have looked at it, which has shown a concern that if it requires too much working memory, then we're not actually looking at language skills. And that's really what we want to focus on, right? Because that's what we want to improve. So we're not focusing on improving working memory per se. We want to help people improve on their language skills. So we need to make sure we're testing for that. I mean, I'm the first to admit that the ASL test was already developed. It was a good test, and it was quite easy for us to then take and modify for our context here in Sweden and using Swedish Sign Language. And as a lot of you know, sign language research is quite broad. There's a lot of things that have been looked at that have not been looked at yet within sign language research that spoken languages have. So we are quite limited in terms of our resources, either other assessments or other just published research that we can sort of piggyback on and use to support our own research in these various sign languages. We just don't have that yet, that sort of breadth of resources. So we have developed 2 assessments, 2 SRTs for Swedish Sign Language, looking at adult language competency. And we want to compare adult with children's language. Is it different? Is it similar? Do these assessments work for both these populations? But we've started off focusing on adult language. Now, Sign Rep 2, the other assessment that we have created, is more interested in L2 learners of Swedish Sign Language. But we also look at children and those who are hard of hearing learning sign language as well. It doesn't get used on native signers. So we're kind of curious about how that comparison is going to work, right? That's what we've been wanting to sort of understand. So in general, just to give a basic explanation of the SRT, the sign repetition test, an individual will watch on a screen. They'll see a sign being produced on the screen. It could a sign sentence, sorry, it could be a short sentence, it could be a long sentence. Regardless, they will watch it, and then there is a blank screen which comes up, and they're asked to give the response, which is to then produce exactly what they've just seen to the best of their ability. And they're allotted a certain amount of time in which to do that, depending on how long the original sentence was, right? And then this goes on in that format for the duration of the test. So for the Swedish Sign Language SRT, as I said, we adapted it from the ASL version. One example, there's I think 20 sentences in the ASL SRT, and they have varying degrees of complexity amongst those sentences in their SRT. So we took those 20, we translated them into Swedish Sign Language. And we also added some new sentences as well. So we already had a sign language corpus here for Swedish Sign Language. So we looked into that corpus and we took some sentences from there. We ran a pilot study to test those sentences, and we narrowed it down, and we ended up with 31 sentences with some were translated from the ASL SRT, and then some we took from our corpus. And then we had 12 that we created on our own that were novel. But we followed the format of the testing itself from the original ASL SRT. And we needed to rate whether or not these productions were an equivalent match, or if there were any errors. So if there was an error, any error at all, they were rated 0. If it was spot on, then they were given a 1 score. So it was either a binary score of 1 or 0. So here's an example of an easy sentence. You could even try it yourself if you want to. If you're feeling up to it right now, feel free to try it yourself. Oh, that didn't play. Let me see if I can get that to work. Oh, here we go. What do you think? Was that okay? Was that it's not too difficult, right? But this was the sign, the sign sentence for an individual. And he used a deixis, right? This is pronominal pointing to the person that he did not like. Okay. So that was an example of an easy sentence. Now here's an example of a more complex sentence. So you can see it was certainly longer. and is much more difficult to remember. You have to have some familiarity with the language in order to be able to reproduce that particular sentence. So how did we score it? So I told you earlier, we have a binary scoring. It's either perfect or there's an error. And in the US, they have a manual for scoring so that their raters can be consistent. Now, there are some signs which have their own natural variations of how they are produced, which are considered acceptable because they all express the same concept as the original. So an example in Swedish Sign Language, for the concept of apartment, you can sign it this way, the way that I'm signing it right now, or you can sign it this way. So a slight variation in the production in terms of the hand positioning. But we'll see lots of variation. So originally we thought, well, it has to be exactly the same. We cannot accept any variations on this, right? That's the expectation of the SRT. However, if the person uses their own variation, which has happened when we've looked at the SRTs, we then look at, well, if over 40% of the responses are like this, then we say, okay, we're going to accept that variation as and give the mark a 1 rather than a 0 because it's appearing more than 40% of the time. So then later on, when we have these variations, we know whether or not a variation is considered acceptable and they still receive the full points for that, or if we determine that that variation coming up is not acceptable, and then we mark it as 0. So that's really helped us in making those determinations and makes it really clear for the raters so that they know what scores to be attributing. So consistency and reliability, right? So if we have a complex sentence versus an easy sentence or an easier sentence, the easier sentence requires less skill than a harder sentence would require, right? A good result would be 0.9. That's what we're looking for. In terms of reliability, so we give it to 2 raters. We then compare the ratings and see, and we're looking at inter-rater reliability. And if we get the score, then we know that we are on target. I'm just looking at the time. I need to move a little bit faster here. Right. So for the Sign Rep L2 assessment, which is a little bit different than the previous, the SRT, because this one is focusing, again, as I said earlier, on L2 learners of the sign language. And this was related to a particular project that Holstrom led, which focused on teaching Swedish Sign Language and being able to assess these students. And to help them in their journey of learning the language. So the design is similar to what I've just explained with the SRT, but there are smaller sentences, and we even have single signs that they're expected to repeat. We go up to 2, 3, and then 4 signs in a row. And altogether we have 40 trials. So there's the L2, M2, right? So second language and second modality aspect to this. And so we have a couple of different scoring perspectives. We know that things like facial expression are also really critical for sign language development. So these are things that we're looking for as well. We're also looking at their phonetic development and positioning. And there's been quite a bit of lit already published, what talks about the phonology of learning a second modality, a visual modality as your second modality. Now, in the previous test, I talked about the binary options for scoring was 0 to 1. Now, for this test, there's actually a scale of 5. options. So here's just one example. So this is an example of just one sign. And you can see that he just produced 3 signs in a row. And here's the rating scale. So it runs from 0 to 4. If the person was completely incorrect, obviously they were given a 0. They received a 1. If they got at least half of the items correct. And then they can reach higher scores as they do better and better from there. If they've done most of it correct, but they got 1 minor error, we give them a 3. And if they produce exactly the same as the original source, then they get a 4. Now, it would be impossible for me to go through this with you in any sort of detail today, but just briefly to say that each item that we have on this test has a corresponding number attributed to it based on these various categories. So some signs have some morphological information. I'm trying to think for in terms of various types of movement. And so each of these have a different score. Maybe for non-manuals as well, it has its own expectations that need to be reproduced. And so the scoring goes according to all of these different aspects. So I'm actually going to jump ahead to the last slide because I think I've carried on a bit too slowly here. So just to compare these 2 different tests that we have developed. I mean, there's going to be pros and cons per usual for any 2 things that you're comparing. For the regular SRT, we have a very limited scoring in terms of its binary. So it doesn't give you a detailed view on what the errors are within the production. So it doesn't really help with including language proficiency. It doesn't really assess with that. It also doesn't take non-manuals, for example, into consideration. And for those people who are not proficient in sign language, it's easy for them to not do well. They find it very difficult to perform well on the SRT. Now, with the second test that we've developed, the SignRep L2, because of the scalability, there is a lot more information being provided. It does include various features of sign language rather than just manual features. So which tells us a lot more about the proficiency of sign language that person has. So sorry for going so quickly, but that was my presentation, and hopefully you were able to understand it. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have. Also happy for any suggestions and feedback and the like. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Krista, for your interesting presentation. You do have a number of questions as well as a lot of clapping hands and people approving your presentation. So let me jump quickly to, I'll quickly jump to the first question, calling in Anastasia Parini, so that she can ask her question. Then right after is Baker.
So hi, everybody. First of all, so my question is, so how do you weight the sentences? So do you look at the number of signs that compose the sentence, or do you use the morphological complexity that might be also, for instance, the adverbial incorporation, etc.? And so how then can we weight them in different sign languages so that then we can have also cross-linguistic comparison? So that's my question, and thank you for the presentation, which was super. Thank you.
Well, that's a really good question. Oof. I'm going to say it depends on which test you're using, right? So for the first test, the SRT, what we tried to do was make sure there was variation in terms of the types of sentences that we had. And then in our pilot study of these sentences, you know, we looked at the results and then we were able to sort of group them. And I guess that, yeah, we were able to denote what skills somebody had. So for example, if somebody was a native signer versus somebody who perhaps learned sign language a little bit later in life, right? So we had these different groupings and we looked at how they performed as a group, how they did with the more complex questions, if that really matched with their actual language proficiency or not. Like I said, during our pilot, we had a lot more sentences that we were trialing, and we narrowed it down to those that were consistent. I would say the important thing is that you have the manual, right? And a sort of a rubric for each item in the test. So for example, if you have a more complex, morphologically complex sentence, for example, if the performance you're seeing for that sample tends to have more errors, we're really looking at the individual performance when looking at when considering the scale. Did I answer that question? I did. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, for your question, and also Krista for the answer. And Baker, yeah, I see you turned your video on already. Please go ahead with your question. And also Tobias has a question.
Thanks very much, Krista, for your presentation. Really enjoyed it, and I hope we can be in contact later for more details, because at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, Kate Huddlestone and myself are developing a SRT test for South African Sign Language. And we were immediately aware that we couldn't develop a test for early L1 learners of South African Sign Language without knowing exactly what the adult grammar looked like. And there has been too little research. So we are using a SRT that we have developed together with other data to try and create a more complete grammar. On the basis we have data, we'll have data from 50 young adult signers. So, but my question is specifically about non-manuals, because in one scoring system you used in an earlier paper, you did not include non-manuals in your total score. We are trying to distinguish between different types of non-manuals, ones which are used for grammatical purposes, ones which are used for information structure purposes, and ones which are used for discourse purposes like emphasis. And I wondered whether you have thought about this in your, in your work, and what are your ideas about this kind of distinction?
That's a really interesting, a really good question. Thank you. Thank you, Anne. So with the SRT, the basic original SRT, obviously there was no non-manuals that were considered for those reproductions. So, but what we noticed here in Sweden is that there did need to be some mouthing, right? And a bit of head nodding, especially for negation, that was required. So we had to add that for our SRT. Now for our L2 assessment, we did look, we had some of the shorter sentences, so we were quite aware of the non-manuals related to, and these would be more grammatical, right, for the shorter sentences. Some for emphasis, or head nodding for emphasis. Okay, so the issue then becomes, right, how to document this and how they get rated, right? Is it clear enough for both raters to identify in the same way? And then it becomes a problem for inter-rater reliability, right? If the non-manuals aren't being rated in the same exact way. So for us, we focus more on the grammatical and the mouthing, so sort of lexical-ish non-manuals. Those categories is what we focused more on for our L2 assessment. But it becomes much more complicated if we're looking at all the types of non-manuals, because I think that's going to cause a big problem when it comes to rating those assessments. And we wanted to avoid that.
Thanks very much indeed. Great, but we'll be in contact.
Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about this some more, Anne.
Thank you, Anne, as well for the question, and Krister as well. We are now at the break time. There were two more questions, one from Tobias Haug and one from Katja Tissi. So I'm asking Tobias and Katja to just hold on the question till the discussion phase at the end of the next presentation, so that we can have more time and more space for all the discussion. I hope you agree. I don't want to be rude, but breaks are also important. All right, so this is our break time. We have 10 minutes, so we'll see you back at 10:20. Thank you very much. So just a gentle nudge to make people come back. Here you are. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and introduce the next presenters, which is a group of a few researchers. We have Katja Tissi, Franz Holzenknecht, and Tobias Haug from the University of Teacher Education and Special Needs in Zurich, Alessia Battisti from the University of Zurich, and Nidia De Jong from Leiden University, presenting the development of a fluency rating scale for Swiss German Sign Language. So welcome, and please go ahead with your presentation.
So, yeah, thanks a lot. Let me share the screen. So, can you see the presentation?
Yes, it's visible.
Good. So, good morning, everyone. Well, you maybe can have a quick look at the slide, at the first slide, and then I will start. You see 5 names here. Maria, no worries about the pronunciation. Mine would be pretty bad for Italian names. So, Battisti, correct? So we are 5 people. So 5 people, 4 of us are going to present. So please bear with us that we might need some change when we switch between presenters. My name is Tobias Haug. We are going to talk about the development of a fluency rating scale for Swiss German Sign Language. So you might have a look at the slides yourself. Those are the issues we are going to talk about the next 20 minutes. I have a quick background of the study. We will talk about the construct, what fluency is actually. We will talk about what kind of data we collected that informed the development of the rating scale. And we will talk about the scale. And we were also able to do a rating study, so where the scale actually has been applied, and then we have a quick discussion and outlook, and then we can take questions from the webinar participants. The study I'm talking about is funded by was funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. It was basically about to get a grip on what is fluency. What is fluency actually in Swiss German Sign Language? It was a project that started in the middle of the pandemic in November 2020. It was actually planned to last just for 1 year, but we were able to extend it twice. It's on the concrete level. The idea was to have a fluency rating scale that is informed by data and theory. I'd like to have a look at the slide first. All right, we had 3 work packages. And the very first one was that we organized a focus group with sign language teachers, deaf sign language teachers. And the basic questions we wanted to know, based on their own experience, what are characteristics of fluency in DSGS? And part of those, the results of the focus group also informed the rating scale. And the second work package, this was actually the largest one. We developed 12 experiment signing tasks that were manipulated by complexity and planning time. That meaning participants had 2 minutes of preparation time versus no preparation time. And I'm quite happy about the sample size, to be honest. You know, in Switzerland, we have 3 different sign language, and Switzerland itself is a quite small country. So we were able to recruit Deaf L1 signers, 9, sorry. Then we were able to recruit 10 hearing interpreters and 11 beginning hearing learners. You see here at the CFR level A1, A2, I think most of them are more like A1 than A2. And after that, we were by Deaf annotators team, we had 162 performances that were annotated. And work package 3, so that's actually what we're talking about mostly today, is the development of the rating scale. And now I'm handing over to Nivia.
Yeah, so hello. To inform you about fluency, I will be talking briefly about the construct of fluency for spoken second language. So how fluency is defined in applied linguistics. And the broad notion, which may also be seen as a lay definition of fluency, is actually the broad notion of speaking proficiency as a whole, containing everything like the content, what you're saying, how accurate you're saying, and how fluent you are. However, we are interested in the narrow notion, which is the usual definition of fluency in applied linguistics, and so that it is only part of speaking proficiency. Next slide. So this narrow notion of speaking proficiency encompasses 3 different notions. The first is underlying cognitive fluency. So within a speaker, the ease of processing the thoughts to sounds, to speech. And for sign language, obviously, it would be the ease of the processes while you're signing from thoughts to signs. The utterance fluency is what you can measure in the utterance. And so this has to do with how often you break down in speech, how often you have pauses, and also when you are speaking, or in our case, signing, how fast you would be signing. And finally, perceived fluency is what we measure in when we are rating. It's the impression of the listener about a speaker's cognitive fluency, but obviously that is based on the listener's perception of speech or of sounds. Next slide. So what we did, from theory, we know that preparation time is a factor when you are dealing with fluency. The more preparation time you have, the more fluent you are supposed to be, because you have had the time to think about what you want to say and how to say it before you start. Secondly, the 3 different proficiency groups that we have, we also know from theory that they should be different. The native signers should be more fluent than the interpreters, and the interpreters should be more fluent than the beginner learners. So this is the theory that we know, and with this theory, we investigated the annotated data, looking at hesitations, pauses, stretch signs, and repetition and self-corrections. And we also looked at speed fluency. For speed fluency, we look at number of signs per second. And for breakdown fluency, we look at the number, position, and duration of hesitations. as they occurred. And when people were hesitating, we also looked at non-manual components. Next slide. So let me talk you through the results. On the left, the results for speed fluency. And so here we look at the number of signs per second. And we see in the graph 3 groups that were indeed all of them different from each other, significantly different. On the left, the native signers were faster than the interpreters in the middle, and they were faster than the beginner learners on the right. There was no effect of preparation time, which is in the orange and the blue depicted. So for speed fluency, apparently, we know that this is something to do with fluency. The more proficient you are, the faster you are able to sign. Now, from speaking research, we know that the more fluent you are, the less you pause, the less often you use a hesitation. And so we also looked at this. This is in the middle. There was no significant effect for number of hesitations. However, there was an effect for the position. We found that interpreters use more pauses within signs. Something to discuss later, perhaps. And then, as expected, beginners produce longer hesitation. So when they hesitate, it takes longer, their hesitations. And this was especially so when they did not have time to prepare. I think the most interesting results is in the right column. It's when we looked more into detail at the non-manuals when hesitating. So what we found is that beginners use less non-manuals compared to other groups. So they use the interpreters and the native signers use their mouth, their brows, and their head when they were hesitating, but beginner learners did not so. And so there is not so much an effect of amount of hesitations, but it's the way you hesitate. When you're a native signer, you know how to use non-manuals. Okay, next slide.
All right. Thanks, Nivia. So basically, based on the analysis Nivia was just presenting, we developed a fluency rating scale, which will be presented by Katja just in a moment. So basically, we had 3 kinds of data that informed, not 2 kinds of data that informed the development of the rating scale. It was mostly informed by the statistical analysis of the annotated data. And it was also informed about the results of the focus group with deaf sign language teachers. And it was also informed by theory. So what Nivia was presenting, also we know from theory, from spoken language, but also what has been published on sign language fluency so far. So now I hand over to Katja.
I want to make sure that can everybody see the PowerPoint? I want to make sure I can see it as well.
Sure.
I'm sorry, just give me 1 moment.
Katja, you are pinned and correctly visible now.
Okay, you can. Okay. But I can't see the PowerPoint. That was the problem. So anyways, thank you. Hi, I'm Katja, and I work with Tobias and the group here. So my portion of this presentation is a focus on the rating scale, the fluency rating scale. So you've already heard about the L1 and the L2 and the novice signers, as well as the interpreter L2 signers. So we've compared across these three groups, and the intention is that for that to help us further develop our scale. Now, we also had focus groups, which we interacted with. Now, I have to say the process itself was not an easy one. When we used to look at sign fluency, I mean, there wasn't any, empirical evidence for anything in the past, but we have been acquiring more understanding, very much and thanks to this particular project. So here we have a lot of disfluency. So there's a scale of disfluency across the board, right? Where there are occasions of less disfluency and a lot of disfluency. So that's been really helpful to us. So when there is a moment of disfluency, we then measure how long is that moment? Is it a long moment? Is it a short moment? We also look at it in terms of the non-manuals that are shown at that time. Do they match up or are they mismatched? And from that information, you can tell what is happening in that moment. And that helps us in the rating. So we can count how many times this is happening, how long are those moments, and do the non-manual expressions match or are they mismatched? Now, when these moments of disfluency happen, or these pauses, it affects the fluency of the entire utterance. But there are also moments where there is a sign that is held for a longer time, and that's utilized as a strategy. And you can see when that's being done. I'm trying to think of an example. I might sign this, or something like this. And that makes it very clear. Okay, obviously, this person right now is using a sign in their break moment of disfluency, right? And whatever this gesture is or sign they're using is helping them to prepare for what they're going to say again. Another strategy is repetition. So they might sign something and then self-correct, so they can then use the correct sign that they wanted to use. Another example that we've seen are individuals who will sign something and then they restart the sentence and they circle back. Then that may happen a couple of times, because what they're looking for is that the sentence that they put out into the world is the one that they want to be seen. And so they have a couple of tries before they get to the one that they're satisfied with. So these are different kinds of disfluency. The first one I spoke to, where there's very clear pauses. The second type of disfluency, where they are elongating the time of a particular sign, and then also repetition. And then the third kind, which is where they just restart the entire utterance over from the beginning. So on our rating scale, there are these categories based on, what we have seen. So when the person is repeating their sign, or in the moment where they are restarting the utterance, those are the last two categories. They're not always clearly distinct. There is a little bit of convolution that happens there. And so we've been trying to develop a system which will allow us to make a more clear distinction between whether it's the second category of repetition or elongation versus if it's restarting the entire sentence. So we've been working on how to make those very clear for our rating. So here's our rating scale. We've been making some really good progress, I would say. We still have some more work to do to make it even more robust. We're really trying to understand what fluency even means. There are examples where you can see, okay, obviously the signer is incredibly fluent with their language production. And there's examples of those who you can see, okay, obviously they're not fluent because they're using all these other strategies that I just spoke about. And that dichotomy helps us to understand what's happening on either end of the scale. So I will now turn it over to somebody else.
Okay. Yes, before I hand over to Franz, so
Wrong slide.
basically, no, Franz, sorry, it's yours. Your part.
No,
Sorry.
it's the wrong slide. You went one slide too far.
Oh, sorry. All right. So we were also able we are able to recruit 3 deaf sign language teachers, DSJS with German Sign Language. Katja was conducting a rater training with them online. And actually, all sign production we have, this was the same as the one we used for the annotated data. That's like 162 productions, which were between 15 to 30 seconds. They were rated by all 3 raters. Yeah, and each production was about 20 to 30 seconds long. So I will now hand over to Franz, who will present on the results.
Okay, it's just can you go to the next slide, Tobias, please? So we analyzed this rating data. Previous slide, yes. We analyzed this data using many facets RASH measurement to see whether what Nivia was talking about before actually also holds up for the ratings. Oh, the interpreter is no longer pinned. Tobias, can you spotlight the interpreter? Thanks. So in order to do that, we created a 5-facet model consisting of the raters, the signers, those were the participants. We also included the language backgrounds of the signers in the model as a dummy facet. And the tasks and the criteria were included as a separate facet in the model. Next slide, please. So these are the results, just very briefly. We had quite a good model fit. So the RASH measures explained about 50% of the variance. We also had very good fit statistics throughout all of the facets. So there were no misfitting raters, no misfitting signers, no misfitting tasks, and no misfitting criteria, which was good. When you look at the column for the raters, and you can click next, Tobias, please. You can see that of the 3 raters, 1 rater was much more severe than the other 2 raters. Rater 3 down there was rating much more harshly than the other 2 raters. The other 2 raters agreed with one another very well. However, rater 3 was consistently severe. So he or she showed very good fit statistics. They were just stricter in applying the rating scale. Now, when you look at the participants column, next, Tobias, please. you can see that the L1 participants, so the deaf signers, performed the best out of the three, which is what we expected, which is what we hoped for. If it were the other way around, there would be something wrong with the rating scale, but this actually confirmed the findings of the annotated data. The L1 raters performed better than the L2 interpreters, and there was quite a gap between those two and the L2 learners. So the L2 learners performed the worst. They received the lowest ratings. When we look at the task column, next, Tobias, please. This also confirmed the findings of the annotated data, that there was no difference really between the 6 tasks. So 3 of the tasks were with preparation time and the other tasks were without preparation time. And interestingly, that didn't make any difference. So the model was not able to separate between those 6 tasks in terms of, or between those tasks in terms of difficulty. And that's something we need to look into, why that might be the case, that preparation time did not really have an effect. And finally, when we look at the criterion column, next, Tobias, please. We can see that there was quite a bit of difference between the 6 criteria statistically. So criteria 1, 2, and 3, you may recall, were about pauses, and those criteria were the most difficult to get a lot of points at for the 3 groups, whereas the other criteria, especially criterion 6, was quite a bit easier to score highly. And I think I'll hand back over to Tobias to finish it off.
All right. Thanks a lot. Oh, wait, hang on. I'm clicking. Okay. Yeah. Discussion will be quick. So I think we have a very good basis for the future use of the scale in different assessment contexts. So I think we need to, as you could tell by what we have talked about, there are more questions at the end. Well, that's normal, right? But I'm really looking forward to use it also with our interpreting students here in Zurich, to use this as part of a larger assessment battery. So I think we have a good basis to further use it and also look into it, all those open questions we still have for the future. And we are currently preparing a publication, which hopefully should be out at some point next year. So, and if you have questions on the publication or on the results, just approach us. So I will stop sharing screen now. All right.
Okay, thank you very much, Tobias, Franz, Katja, everybody for your presentation. Is there any specific question? Again, I see a lot of appreciation on your speech. I also see a few hands raising for questions. So please be minded, this is the brief 10-minute session just for the latest presentation, the third one. We will later have an extra few minutes, extra half hour actually, for further discussion, where I will also call in the previous presenters to talk. Also, please note, if you are on your way out and you will have to leave before the time, please remember to fill in our survey. I will leave the link in the chat area in a few minutes. So let's go ahead with the questions. Norman, you're the first. Norman Verhest. I don't know. Norman, please.
Yeah, thank you. I liked it very much, but
I'm sorry.
Oh, by the way, Norman, can you please turn on your video?
In just one moment, we're going to switch interpreters. I want to make sure that my colleague is spotlit before Norman asks his question. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, go ahead.
okay. Well, as I said, I liked it very much. It's well equilibrated. But when I see the scale that has developed, I see that 3 of your 6 criteria have to do with pauses. And the model that we use for the analysis assumes that all these criteria form a single dimension. I'm not very convinced by the analysis that you have a clear evidence that this is real one dimension. So I would suggest you to do some kind of differential item functioning or task functioning. You can apply profile analysis to see if you can see differences between your 3 groups, say between the tasks, the pause tasks and the pause criteria and the other 3 criteria. I think you should be careful in that, because you could maybe, with some imagination, you could have had 4 or 5 criteria directly related to pauses, and then you would draw your theoretical concept much more in the direction of the pauses. That's what my consideration is with your investigations. If you need help for further discussion, I'm always prepared to discuss with you and to help you in the way I can. Thank you.
Franz, would you like to respond?
Yeah.
Sure. Great.
Just starting with the spotlights. I'm multitasking here. Yeah, thank you very much, Norman, for this. This is actually something that we wanted to do. I didn't have time to go into detail here, but we also noticed that the 3 pause criteria are quite close together, and we'd need to look further into it, whether there is really a statistical difference between the 3 pause criteria, or whether it would make sense to merge them in some way, so we can be sure that they actually measure different subconstructs. So thank you for this comment.
Okay, the next up is Krister. Just give me a little time to manage the pinning system. All right, Krister. Krister, you're pinned. If you want to turn on your video. Oh, you think Thomas was first. Thomas, do you agree if Krister asks his question before you do?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
thank
it's
you very
fine.
much,
It's fine. It doesn't
Krister.
matter to me. Doesn't matter to me. I'm happy either way.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Right. So first of all, thank you for your presentation. How interesting. Your discussion specifically about fluency. I've got many questions. I'll only ask you one for the moment. In terms of the self-assessment, I recently looked at, in terms of Swedish Sign Language for the L2 learners, I looked at how they determined their own fluency. And we recently published with Johanna Mesh, looking at, L2 learners and how they do this. So for those who are novice signers, you could see that in their self-assessment, they rated quite high. And then very quickly, they lowered their own scores on these self-assessments as they progressed in language learning. And I'm wondering if you saw that same sort of phenomenon happening with your L2 learners.
I can try. All good? Okay, Chris, I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly. Are you talking about self-assessment or self-correction? Because the participants, the L2 learners, they didn't self-assess themselves.
Correction. Sorry, that was an interpreter error. I'm asking about correction.
Okay. And can you then please repeat your question?
Okay, so we've done our own looking into research on L2 learners and their self-corrections that they've made, right? The errors that they're making and how they correct those errors. So for novice signers, we see an extraordinary amount of self-correction. And then very quickly, that time reduces as they progress in their language learning. So I'm wondering if you have seen the same thing amongst your L2 learners, and if you're seeing a huge amount of self-correction initially, and then a quick drop in terms of those occasions, as we have seen. So I'm curious what your data shows.
Maybe Franz, you just join in later if you want. But I mean, our data we just collect, we didn't have any longitudinal data, so we just looked at them at one point at time. So it's hard to tell if there will be a sharp drop, and we have just this group basically. So therefore it's hard to respond to your question. Franz, would you like to add something?
Yeah, this is something we haven't had time to look into yet. So what we'd like to do is do some bias analysis in Rush to see whether certain criteria, such as self-corrections, were used more often by L2 learners, or whether also for the other criteria, whether there were differences between the three language groups and the amount of pauses, for example. So this is something we still need to do in further analysis, but thanks for the question.
Sure.
Sorry, I was silenced. So let's go to the next question. That's Thomas Geisler. Still, the day is not my day with pronunciation. So just a second. Okay. All right, you're in sight.
Hello. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. Here at the University in Berlin, we are also spending a lot of time thinking about how to perfect an assessment and rater reliability, etc. So I've got, like Christer said, many questions, but going to be asking just one for the moment. For the tasks that you spoke about, what were they? I'm asking because there are multiple tasks that look at that have different kinds of complexity. And if we're looking at fluency, I think when you're comparing those that had preparation time and those who didn't, now for production, you would expect the fluency to be better if they've had preparation time. So I'm really curious what those tasks were. And then I just go ahead and I'll ask another question. And maybe I'm jumping a little bit too much here, but when we look at what SEFRA offers us, they talk about A1 not expecting fluency, right? Compared to at C2, right? So then how do you attribute points in this? Because we know at A1, fluency isn't even important in the teaching. So then how are you able to rate fluency if we're not even teaching fluency yet? Those are my questions.
Nivia, would you like to add on the tasks?
Yes. Indeed, we had tasks with and without preparation time, as I told you. We also tried to manipulate the complexity of the tasks. And they were, so for instance, one task was a task where you had to place people in a train according to their wishes. So some someone maybe a hungry person, so you should place him next to the snacks. Or someone likes to look at the landscape, so you would want to place this person next to the window. And so the complexity was manipulated by having just a couple of people to place or more people to place. But we did not find any effects of complexity whatsoever. So we decided not to look at these, but only look at the comparison with and without preparation time. I'll stop here.
If I could say something, could I also add to this response?
Sure.
Katya, your evidence, so you can add whatever you want.
Oh, great, great. Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you, Thomas. As has already been said, we assigned these tasks, and some of them did offer preparation time before they were expected to produce. And then some were online, right, where they were not given any preparation time. And we were also surprised that even with the preparation, the fluency wasn't any better, that the results came up that they were quite similar. Now, there was one task that we assigned where people watched a video and they were actually signing it as they were watching it. So we could see that influenced that influenced the fluency. And it affected the non-manual signals. But then for the next task that they were given, we took the video off. So, and we could see that the results were a lot better. Just, that's an important thing, I think, to share. And Thomas, I said, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. We have a next question from Ute, and by the way, we are now in the time where anyone can ask to any presenter, so it's the discussion phase. Whenever you want, you can just, again, raise your hand and so that I can see you, and then you can come up next for the discussion. And Ute, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you. I actually had 3 questions, and I'm really grateful that Norman asked my first one for me. So thank you for that. That was about dimensionality. My second question is to Franz. I'm curious whether you examined the scale structures of the subscales and whether they, the rationalysis supported all the, I can't remember whether it was a 6 or 7 or 8 point scale, sorry, but like whether that was actually supported for all the subscales. And my third question, sorry, is for Nivia, and I'm wondering whether you have any sense of how the scale you developed would relate to perceived fluency.
Yeah, thanks, Ute, for this question. This is something I also didn't have time to talk about. So we looked at the Resch-Hendrich thresholds of the scale, and each of the scale points was modal, but what we did find was that scale points 1 and 2 should be combined according to the Resch-Hendrich threshold, so that instead of a 6-point scale, we'd have a 5-point scale. But we're not quite sure how to proceed, because you might recall that in the scale only the extreme points are described, and the middle in between points, so 2, 3, 4, and 5 are not described. Whether we should still go ahead and combine 1 and 2 to make it into a 5-point scale, or whether that then would, if we collected the data again.
Finding across all subscales, or is this just for overall?
This is
like, did all the subscales have exactly the same scale structure? I would find that very surprising.
Oh, we haven't looked at all the different criteria yet. This was just the
Ah, okay.
the
Yeah,
overall.
because I reckon you will find some differences for the subscales if you do
Yeah,
the
thanks. We have to-
sub-analysis.
Yeah, but yeah, we're not sure if we found, like for the overall structure, if we find that 1 and 2 should be combined, ideally we'd need to collect the data again to see if we would get different results. You see what I mean? This is a general question I often have when looking at the scale structure, just based on one data set, and you then combine 2 scale points. Wouldn't you then need to collect more data to confirm whether the new scale structure is actually working better?
Probably, and you would probably want to have some different test takers to see whether it's transferable as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm.
Thanks. Handing over to Nidia.
Yeah, thanks for that question. In the end, you ask about how the scale represents perceived fluency. And so in the end, you want perceived fluency to reflect cognitive fluency. That's what you would want. And the scale represents cognitive fluency because we try to put in theory in the scale plus what we found from the annotations. And so because we found in the annotations that use of non-manuals was a significant factor, we decided to keep it in the scale. And so perceived fluency in the end is what you instruct your raters to do. If we instruct our raters to focus only on speed fluency, then that is what we will measure.
But that's operationalized fluency. That's not perceived. Isn't perceived what a general listener would like? To me, perceive, well, I guess you could say it in any way, but to me, it's what a kind of innocent listener would perceive as fluency rather than a trained rater.
I think innocent listeners, you don't know what they focus on. So they may focus on grammaticality or content. And if we want them to measure the ease of processes from thoughts to signs, then we have to tell them what to focus on. Otherwise, they will focus on things that are not related to the construct that we mean. We can also give, which we have also done not in this project, but in other projects, give raters the assignment to indeed focus on these cognitive fluency definitions. And then you will find that you get very similar aspects as you get when you have them focus on things that we know from theory and things that we found in annotations as representing cognitive fluency.
I think my question is more about what an innocent listener would make of fluency and how that relates to your theoretical definition of, I guess, cognitive fluency. I'm curious how the innocent, untrained person on the road would score without a described rating scale, how they would score fluency, and whether that would relate to your kind of cognitive theoretically based scale, if that makes sense.
It would relate partly to it, but also partly not. Because a lay person in the street may focus on accent because they don't know what fluency is, or they may focus on accuracy because they don't know what fluency is. As I said, fluency in lay terms is the whole of speaking proficiency. That's not what we mean to measure, because we know people can be more or less fluent, which is a different construct from being more or less accented or more or less accurate. So I don't want to ask the person in the street if I want to focus on fluency.
So I
Thank
guess the
you.
question was answered. Okay, is there anyone who wants to ask a question to any of the presenter, or do we want to continue the discussion? There were a few questions for Christian, so this is the time if you want. Tobias, I see your hand, so just a second. Okay, there you are in the spotlight.
All right. Actually, it was more of a comment than a question. I think it was a question asked by what's the name, Anastasia, right? About how sentences, SRT sentences can be like labeled or built up on in terms of complexity. And I just wanted to briefly mention something on a project we worked on in the past. We had a project about 10 years ago as SRT that was mostly based on the German version, DGS version, and American version, focusing at deaf children and adolescents between 6 and 16 years old. At the same time, we also collected data from 10 deaf adult signers. So basically, during the development of the test, actually redefined for us complexity in a mix of, let's say, number of signs plus morphological complexity. Let's say a lexical sign might be perceived to be less complex than, for example, a classifier construction. Interestingly, but I haven't looked at it in detail after a statistical analysis, we ordered the sentences in terms of their supposed complexity. That didn't work out. So the sentences we have now, from our side, perceived complexity sentences at the very beginning. So they seem to be more easier. And those where we thought they are easy actually are in statistical terms are more complex. But that's just not really, that's something we need to further investigate. It's not a generalization I want to put out there. All right, thanks.
There's a question from Ute. So there you go, Ute, please.
Thank you. I've got a kind of more general question, because obviously sign language assessment is not my area. And from the two presentations that I saw today, they were focused on what I would sort of think of as subconstruct of language proficiency. So there was sentence repetition and fluency, and to me they're kind of subconstructs of the wider language proficiency. And I was wondering whether there are any scales on sign language that are developed more for very specific purposes. So these scales that we saw today, I imagine they can be used for a range of purposes. They're more like a general construct. And I'm wondering whether they're scales that look more broadly at sign language proficiency and also for specific purposes of use.
Thank you for your question, Ute. Anyone of the presenter who wants to reply? Nivia?
Yeah, just very brief as a acknowledgement that indeed our scale is a subconstruct of overall signing proficiency, the subconstruct of fluency. And perhaps that also relates to my answer to your previous question.
Tobias?
I could add something, maybe also ask my deaf colleagues like Thomas or Krista to respond to it. So meaning, Ute, what you were saying, more general, like a general proficiency, there are instruments around, especially in the United States. There's this Sign Proficiency Interview, or SLPI, that's been used. It's based on the OPI, or a proficiency interview. It's been developed, I think, I don't know when in the US, 1980s, or maybe even earlier. That's an adaptation. It has been used in different sign languages, and we are currently attempting to develop something not similar, but like a more of an interview interaction kind of approach. Looking at specific aspects, I mean, the interesting thing is when you look at what has been published about sign language assessment, you can find much more about how to assess children and how to assess adult learners or users of a sign language. So there's not a lot around, to be honest. But I think there are a lot of tests around maybe within programs. That's why I was wondering if maybe Thomas or Krista, if you could say something, or Katja.
One specific purpose that I imagine would be for assessing maybe teachers of sign language. For example, I wonder if there's scales like that. Because teacher language proficiency is a big thing. So I'm assuming it's also a thing for teachers of sign language. So are there scales that are, geared at a specific purpose, not just general proficiency or a subset, like a sub-construct of language proficiency? I feel like there's so much there that could be really interesting to look at.
What you are asking, you mean like especially like professional language use for sign language teachers, for example? How they use language in the class, should use. As far as I know, there's nothing around. I think there's a huge need for that. Definitely, totally
Interesting
agree.
project.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Or for sign language interpreters, it's another specific purpose use, right? Which I'm sure there needs to be an assessment for too.
Yeah, there are assessments.
Katja would like to add something, so please, Katja, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, wow, what a really important question. How do we assess sign language fluency for these purposes? Now, we don't have a completed one, but thanks to this project and allowing us to understand fluency more, it will then take us to a place where we can look at that. But we have to first come up with what this criteria is. What makes fluency? What does fluency look like? And use empirical data to show this. And then further to that, we will be able to create assessments for L1, L2 as well. Right. And then we will have these markers for what it is to be fluent in this way. But it's very challenging work to do. I think that we do have sort of a general intuitive sense of what is fluent. But that you can't use that for rating, right? You can't use intuition for that. You have to have empirical, you have to have stats and numbers in order to do that. So in Europe, we have a European-wide sort of conversation about how to make this happen, how to do this. But we've all come back to the same thing: is how do we denote fluency? But thank you for your question.
Krister, probably, yes, I see his hand raising. Okay, just a second, Krister. Okay, there you are.
Yes, I also want to thank you for that question. I have the same question, and I've had it for a very long time. This is something that we have struggled with. I think it becomes quite problematic because sign language research until now, L1 research, L2 research, and what we know about all of these things is very minimal compared to what we know about spoken languages. So can I create an assessment based on something that we don't fully know yet? Not really, right? So as I talked about in my presentation, the first step is identifying these things. The same as what Katja just said. First, we have to identify the criteria to be able to talk about fluency, what fluency is, before we can really develop assessments to look at fluency. So if we can do a global test, right? We can do the SRT. And as I talked about our own Swedish SRT, it gives you a sort of a global idea of language proficiency, but no, it's not for a specific, it's not a specific sub-construction. We're we're not looking really in that sort of detailed way. It's much more of a global, general language fluency. Can this person communicate? And I think there are a lot of pros to being able to have that and be able to make a distinguishment between various groups and different fluency groups. But yeah, it doesn't tell you enough about what fluency actually is. Those tests aren't specific enough. And that is what has been problematic, and why we can't yet do what you're suggesting. So, but hopefully, you know, as more and more sign languages are researched and these kinds of things are identified, we can then create assessments based on those criteria that we've found.
Thank you, Krista. I see Katya and Thomas have their video on, so I don't know if you want to also add some questions or if anyone else wants to add. Nancy, thank you very much for your feedback. We appreciate having you here today. Tobias, yes. Thomas, do you have a question? I see your finger. Just a second, Thomas. Tobias, do you want
I
to
have
ask?
a question, but I also have a comment I'd like to make.
Okay, Tobias, so should I give okay. So Thomas, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, okay. Wow, yeah, what a problem we have. Assessments are so complicated, and we've been having these problems for a really long time. Everybody's, you know, off on their own, their silos creating these assessments. And as Krista said, there's been so little research until now. And also, the SRT has not been matched to CEFR, right? So SRTs were established a long time ago, but CEFR is a fairly new thing. And so we still need to understand how to do these SRTs and make sure it's matched with the CEFR, which we didn't have before, right? So these are just tests that are and assessments that are developed sort of on their own in these various contexts around the world. Now, having a rating manual is allowing us to become more focused with our assessments, but we've only up until now been able to look at very general ideas of fluency and not specific. Now we can ask these questions like, what is fluency? What does fluency look like? How do we say this is fluent, this isn't fluent? But it's highly complex. But as we're coming up with these tools, that's really gonna push us forward. And then the second thing I wanted to say is actually a question related to something that Krista said. With the SRT, we have a really big challenge there, and the challenge is that yes, the SRT, there is an aspect of it which actually is testing working memory versus language capacity, right? Can the person remember the sentence, right? So there's a little bit of interference there. But for me, the problem then becomes, how do you separate, is a person just copying what they've seen, right? They're copying it. They're not really, how do we know that that's showing fluency, right? I may not know another sign language, but I can certainly copy it and regurgitate it. I can reproduce it. How do we know that that's living in somebody's memory and that's becoming a part of their language, the actual languaging experience? Or are they just blanket copying, right? So if I could do that in Swedish Sign Language, how could you say that I have any sort of fluency in Swedish Sign Language if all I'm doing is copying it? So this is another thing that I question about this, but thank you for letting me say that.
Great comment. Ute had a question and also Tobias, so I don't know who of you wants to speak first.
I think I had my hand up first, doesn't matter. Thomas, I really enjoyed your comment just now because it's exactly what I've been thinking about, and not in relation to sign language, but in relation to spoken assessment and the increasing automation of assessments in English language. What you're describing, I mean, the sentence repetition task is very similar to tasks that are increasingly becoming popular in English language assessment that are delivered through technology, which are like listen and repeat, for example. And it's, you know, the proponents of those kind of tasks take a very cognitive view of language. And they're saying that that's a really good indication of language proficiency. Whereas I argue that, just like you just did, that it doesn't show any production, right? You're just sort of parroting back, and it shows us aspects of language proficiency, like pronunciation, fluency. You can measure those, but there's no real production, and that's limited, you know, and I think that's particularly giving a limited view of language proficiency at the higher proficiency levels. You know, where you need to be able to do so much more than just say, listen and repeat, or watch and sign back. Thomas, no, Krista, it was you, sorry. You said that you need to learn more about what sign language proficiency is before further scales for specific purposes can be developed. And obviously those theoretical dimensions are really important. I fully agree with that, and research needs to be done in that area. But there are other ways to develop scales. For example, if you think about, you know, maybe sign language teacher language proficiency, you can develop them through the input of domain experts, and they may be less theoretically based then, but they're still giving a really good indication of what matters to people in the field. You know, what about teacher sign language proficiency is important in the classroom, and you can develop scales, you know, with less just a cognitive theoretical focus, that are really good and useful, and there's been quite a lot of work done in language for specific purposes in spoken language.
Interesting comment. Thank you, Uta. Tobias, it's your moment.
All right, I think we have to wrap up soon, right? Just two comments about what Uta and also what Thomas was saying. As for the SRT, I guess the SRT is definitely not the perfect test to assess overall proficiency. I totally agree, but it might be one tool among others. And about what Thomas was saying about this is just parroting, basically, I think that we have starting evidence indicating that it's not just parroting something, because you see difference. There's a study for ASL, I think it definitely shows that there are differences between early learners of a sign language and late learners. So there's evidence around. The other thing is how to match a CFR, because we just ran into this problem, how to match an SRT with the CFR levels. It's impossible because you find any scale. There are no scales in the CFRs that actually focus at repetition for obvious purposes. The other thing is an SRT.
Tobias, that last sentence went by so quickly. I don't think I heard a word in it. I'm sorry.
Okay. The problem is that matching or aligning SRT tests with the CFR is problematic, because you don't find any scales that describe repetition. It's not comprehension, it's not production, right? It's both involved. So that's why it makes it hard. It's kind of like impossible. And the other thing, it's totally not really focusing on communicative competence, right? If you frame language learning in this context, it's not really helpful. I still think it's a useful tool, but not replacing everything. It's just one tool, right? Among other things we are planning to develop. That's my perspective on it. Thanks.
All right, so we still have 2 minutes, exactly 2 minutes. So if anyone wants to add a very quick question, we still have a little time. I see people going, so thank you very much for being here today. There's a question, Thomas. My question refers to how to separate between copy and real understanding. So if anyone wants to answer to that. The discussion is going on in the chat. Okay, so I'll spot, I don't know. Well, in all cases, we're running low on time. So let me just remind you once more about the survey. It's important for us. It helps us to define the topic for the next webinar. So if you did enjoy this webinar, please do add your feedback for us. I would like to spotlight the participants of the day. So we have Ute, Tobias, Franz, Nivia. There you go. Please turn on your video so that we can say goodbye to you and thank you for being part of this this very interesting day of discussion. Personally, even though we did add like 1 hour and a half to our discussion, I should say I still feel the need of more time for discussing these topics. So I hope this is a shared need by all of the participants. There you go. So thank you very much, Ute, and all the speakers. Oh, okay, yes, Tobias, please.
Just a last word. I totally agree. I think we should have something on site at some point, a workshop. We used to have it in the past. I think, Krista, you were on all 3s we had so far in Zurich. So I really hope that we can have one, I guess not in 24, but maybe in 25 with colleagues from spoken language assessment and sign language assessment. That would be my short-term vision. So, Ute, let me have you over.
Okay, so well, thank you very much. Thank all the people who came in today and adjusted their time schedule to be here today. We really appreciate you being here. We appreciate people coming from all over the world. We feel very special today. Thank you for the questions, for the interest. Again, the webinar was recorded, so you will see it coming up on our social Facebook page or also on the Alta page. If not, you can email to Tobias. His email is in the chat, so you will find it. Someone have asked for the presentation. Again, please email Tobias for that. And any other questions or feedback or whatever, Tobias is the reference person for everything. So thank you again for being here, and thank you all for this wonderful chance to discuss this topic. Thank you to the interpreters, of course, for all the mediation work they've done. And again, have a wonderful day or good night if you're on the other side. Thank you again.
Thanks. Thanks,
Bye-bye
everyone.
to all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.